Hello and welcome to Drum with Drew. I am Drew and today I'm going to be showing you how to install internal triggers and a mesh head on your snare drum. Now I've already done the bass drum, the rack tom, and the floor tom. The overall process isn't that much different. There are a few nuances with the snare drum, which is why I've chosen to show that one, but overall the process is generally the same. Before we get started, it's important to have the tools you're going to need on hand. And while this process doesn't require a whole lot of tools, I do have a screwdriver, a metal ruler, any ruler will work, the hardware that came with the triggers. These are screws that are a little bit longer than what you'd find on most drums, as well as some washers. The X1 trigger, the rim trigger, and the cable that I'm going to be plugging into the trigger. Before I got started, I marked the location on the drum where I planned to install both the trigger and the jack. That's easiest to do when the drums are actually set up on the drum set. Once you take them off, it can sometimes be hard to picture where you want to put things. It's generally recommended to put the trigger somewhere on the drum where you're not likely to strike it with a stick. I typically put it on a lug closest to me because I'm very unlikely to be playing that close to the rim. You can also put it at the top, anywhere basically that's going to avoid being struck by the drumstick. I've also got a washcloth here to wipe down the inside of the drums as I'm doing this work. I don't plan to remove the heads a whole lot, so I'm going to take this opportunity to do some cleaning. And then I've got an Evans sound-off drum mute that I plan to install on the inside of the drum against the resonant head to cut down on some of the excess noise. There's not a whole lot, but I had this laying around and wanted to use it. If you don't have any of these or don't want to spend the money on it, you could use the head that's already on there. You could take it completely off, or you could even use like a single ply mesh head. Now, I've done a little bit of prep work to make this video easier. I've pre-loosened the tension rods. I've also taken off the snares of the snare drum. Since this is going to be an electronic drum, you don't need these and you don't want them rattling around making excess noise. First things first, we're going to remove the rim. Then take off the head. And now I'm going to clean the inside of the drum a little bit, getting any dust that has accumulated, making sure that the bearing edge is nice and smooth and not going to cause any rips or snags in that mesh head. After I'm done cleaning, I'm going to go ahead and place the Evans sound-off drum mute inside the snare drum up against that resonant head. And then I'm going to start removing the screws from the lug that I've marked. The other nice thing about using tape to mark the location where you plan to install the trigger is that in this specific instance, it actually serves to hold the lug in place after I've taken the screws out, which is kind of nice. As I mentioned, Marshall includes some extra screws with the triggers when he sends them. I found when I was doing the other ones that the stock screws weren't quite long enough to accommodate that bracket. So I'm going to use these larger ones. And basically I'm just going to tighten these just enough to catch so that I have plenty of room to slip the bracket on behind the washers. So those are on there, like I said, just basically tight enough to catch. Now I'm going to slide trigger on there and snug these up just a little bit more I want them tight enough to hold the trigger in place, but not so tight that I can't move it. We want to still be able to move the trigger because we need to fine-tune the height at which the trigger is mounted. Before I do that though, I'm going to install the rim trigger. Since I am right-handed and primarily do rim shots with my right hand, I am going to install the rim trigger on the lug directly to the right of the trigger. This time you only need to remove one screw, the top screw. And again, I will use the hardware provided. And since this doesn't need to make contact with the mesh head, I can go ahead and screw it all the way in. Determining the height at which the trigger needs to be mounted can be a little bit of trial and error. What's recommended is that it be about a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch above the edge of the drum. So what I do to figure that out is put my ruler on here and get it flush with the edge of the drum. Once it's flush, I will move it up just a hair or two, and then snug those screws up the rest of the way. Now we're ready to plug everything in. So with the bass drums and the toms, what you would do is you would take this cable, run the side with the 1/8 inch jack in through the air vent, and plug it directly into the trigger. Since this is a dual zone trigger and we've got the head trigger and the rim trigger, what you actually do though is plug this cable into the rim trigger and then plug the cable running from the rim trigger into the head trigger. I misspoke in one of my previous videos. When I was unpackaging everything, I thought Marshall had mistakenly sent me an X1 trigger instead of the X1R trigger. He replied back and told me that the X1R is basically just an X1 and the rim trigger, and they've been redesigned so that you can basically convert any of your existing X1 triggers just by adding this rim trigger piece. The last thing I'm going to do before I put the head on is to get rid of some of this excess cabling using a twist tie. I don't need much slack on this cable because the jack that I'm mounting it on is right near the air vent. It's typically the recommended location just so that you don't have a lot of excess cable. And the reason I'm wrapping these up is to just cut down on movement. You don't want the cable flopping around as you're playing, making excess noise. So I'm going to double check and make sure everything's plugged in securely. I think we're good to go and put the head on. So we'll place the head on the drum and place the rim on the drum. And then just like with a traditional head, I'm going to tighten these tension rods until they're about finger tight. Those are all finger tight, give or take. What I'm going to do now is do one full rotation on each lug, and then probably about another quarter to half a rotation. The snare drum you do want to be a little tighter than the bass drum and the toms. The tension on the head is another thing that is a little bit of trial and error. You want to find something that works well with the trigger and also with your playing. You don't want it too loose so that there's ripples in the mesh. You don't want it too tight though either so that it is excessively bouncy. So now I've done one full rotation. Like I said, I'm just going to do another quarter to half rotation on each lug. And then I'm going to press around and feel on the mesh just to make sure nothing is excessively loose. You can feel that trigger pressing up against the mesh. That's a good sign. That's how you want it. It needs to maintain contact with the mesh head so that it can transmit the vibrations from the stick hitting the head into the module. The final step is to screw this cable into the bottom tension rod. I've chosen to put it on the bottom. You could do top or bottom, it really doesn't matter, but I find that having it on the bottom tension rod keeps it a little more out of the way. And as I said, I marked on the drum the location of the jack and the direction that it needs to be pointed. That way when the cable comes from the roll-in module, it's pointing in the right direction to be plugged directly in. Again, since this is an electronic drum, the tension doesn't matter too much. I'm just going to do a quick check to make sure there's no ripples in there. And with that, I think we're done with this drum. I'm going to show you the inside of these other drums so that you can see what they look like compared to this snare drum. This is the rack tom we're looking into. It's situated more or less how it will be when I'm playing. I've got the trigger mounted on the lug closest to me as I sit on the throne. The excess cable is wrapped up in a zip tie. It's run through the air vent and attached to the bottom lug in the direction of the module. This is the floor tom we're looking into, and it's situated more or less how it would be when I'm playing. You'll notice I've got the trigger mounted on a tension rod closest to me, sitting on the throne. I've got the sound percussion drum mute down the inside, pressed up against the resonant head. It's the same basic idea as the Evans Sound Off, just a different brand. I've got the excess cable zip tied, run through the air vent, and attached to a lug on the bottom of the drum, pointing in the direction of the module. This is the bass drum that we're looking into, and you'll see that the bracket here is quite a bit larger than the other ones. That's to allow the trigger itself to be mounted a little further in from the edge, partway in between where the beater strikes and the edge of the drum. I've got the excess cable zip tied, run through the air vent, and attached to a tension rod on the top of the bass drum with the jack pointing in the direction of the module. I don't currently have anything on the inside of the drum to dampen it, but I may add some pillows or blankets just to cut down on excess noise and give it a little bit more of an acoustic feel. Thank you for joining me, and if you've made it this far, congratulations. Please like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, drop them below in the comments. I will do my best to answer them. and come back for future videos. I'm really excited to get all these drums set up, plugged into the trigger, and start dialing in the settings there, and that's exactly what my next video is going to be.